and happy International Compost Awareness Week for newcomers. Today I'm going to be chatting with Compostable Kate, and this is a great opportunity for anyone out there who's new to composting, or maybe you've been composting for quite a while now. And yeah, Compostable Kate is one of my favorites out there. She is able to just take composting and put it in a nice little package to make it fun and simple for everyone. So I'm really excited, and I'm gonna screen right now. Hello, hello. Welcome, everybody.
Hello,
Kate.
Peter. How you going?
I'm well. How are you doing today?
I'm good. And the sun is shining, which is so nice.
Fantastic. And for people watching, can you share where you are calling from?
Yes, I am in the backyard of the garden that we're renting here in Bega, which is on the far south coast of New South Wales in Australia. And I'll show you, I'm standing behind all of my compost.
Look at these compost bins.
It's a bit embarrassing. People are going to really realise how many I've got during this live. They'll see that the addiction is real.
Yeah, we'll dive into that. And actually, it's been funny because I've been speaking to a bunch of people this week, and multiple of them have mentioned how it's addictive. Once you start composting, it gets more and more, and you can tell you're an addict.
And, I think I've been thinking about that actually, like why it is. And I think it links into the feeling of like making bread or making your own kombucha or sauerkraut, like being able to harness the power of microbes and to really transform these ordinary scraps into something amazing. I think once you see that, you just don't want to stop making it. it is addictive. So be warned, it's a good addiction to have though.
Absolutely. And I think it's a gateway drug as well. Because composting is relatively easy. And then once people do that, like, wow, what else can I do? Oh, I can start a beehive. Or maybe I can get some solar panels. Maybe I can do this. And so what grows from there? I mean, gardening is obviously the first one because you've got great soil, but totally agree with you there.
It is a gateway activity. And I think that's, it's an empowering thing to know that harnessing your own waste at home really opens your eyes up to the other ways that you're consuming resources, and it does start putting things in perspective and changing for me, it has definitely changed my approach to how I parent my children and the stuff that I get for them, and the stuff that we bring into our house. It puts a lot of things in perspective, which is really, it's great. Great on so many levels.
I know we could like dive into just so many aspects. Like I'm so excited for this conversation because I'm like, hey, we could just nerd out about tiny little microbes and talk about the big philosophical sense and ethics behind composting. But I do want to ask the people out there, I think this is a burning question for them. Why did you start your page? What was the motivation behind it?
Well, prior to having children, I'm a high school food tech teacher. So I'm dealing with lots of teenagers and lots of food waste every day. And so for me, it was during COVID, and also the combination of COVID and maternity leave with my third child, I was at home feeling pretty weird about the world and thinking about how I can give back individually. So I had a really clear, can you hear me? My neighbours.
Yeah, absolutely.
House. Okay. So just tell me if it gets too noisy. I had a clear idea about what I wanted my page to be about. So I wanted it to be an educational platform that made people feel excited about making compost in their own backyard, because it's something that I've always done. My parents have always composted. So I was in a privileged position to always have an active understanding of it, and to feel excited about it myself. My girlfriends, when I told them, I before I signed up, didn't have Instagram, because being a high school teacher, it's just social media really, when used badly in a high school context, is the worst thing. Yeah. So it was a big 180 for me to sign up to have my own page. And telling my girlfriends about that, saying, I'm going to be a composting influencer. And they're like, oh, of course you are, But I think I had a really clear idea about what I wanted to do. And I've quite quickly worked out that when used well, you can change people's perspective on here, and you can really educate people. And I wanted to make my content fun and exciting and sort of irresistible. So people wanted to start composting themselves. So that's the mission that I'm on. And it really does feel like a mission, you know, that it's something that we can all be a part of. It's accessible for everyone. You can find a way to compost in whichever, you know, if you live in an apartment or a house without a yard, there's lots of different avenues. So it's something that we can all feel empowered to do in our own homes.
I love that you said the word empowered, because that's kind of where I feel like is the best direction to go with. You have this waste, and giving people the knowledge and letting them turn that food waste into something precious, turn it into soil.
Yes.
And that feeling that comes with it's like, oh, and the empowerment's so important, I think, today, because we've realized how fragile our systems are. COVID was a big shock to say, wow, like, what if food trucks can't come in? Like, what does that actually mean?
Yes.
So when people have that insecurity, myself included, soil is the foundation. So empowerment, I really like how you've come there, because that's kind of where I sit with it too. And I want to ask you, Kate, because that's a story in itself. That's such an amazing way and journey on how you started this. And I thought about, while you're saying, like, social media, it's kind of like food waste. You can take that food waste and turn it into compost, or it can go to landfill and do something bad.
Right.
And
yes.
It's all about how you use it. It's another tool. And I know you've got a book coming up, because that's a journey. And can you share a little bit about this book you're writing?
Yes. Well, I was talking to my editor yesterday. She gave me a call, and I was literally just writing about worm sex as she then picked up the phone, which is a great topic to get into. So the book is going to be a guide to backyard composting. So looking at the ways that we can use worms, and we can harness the bacteria in all living matter to make garden gold. And I'm also exploring other regenerative gardening techniques in the book too. So making compost teas, and so Korean natural farming is something that I'm really getting obsessed with.
Yes.
And looking at how those processes don't need to be intimidating. We can do them in our own urban backyards to feed the life in our soil. Because when we have healthy soil, then we have a thriving ecosystem that supports healthy plants. And for us, we don't grow all of our own food, but we grow quite a lot of it. So everything starts with soil health. And so that's the focus of my book.
That's awesome. Have you heard of Chris Trump? He's a Korean farmer.
Yes.
He's on YouTube. He is great. He's not related to Trump, Donald Trump, I don't think.
He's the antithesis to Trump.
Fantastic. Anybody who's just Korean farming, fantastic. I just want to read out this question. How much methane generated from food in dumps? Do you want to take that one, Kate?
Yes. So it depends on a number of processes, but basically with food waste can be a climate liability when we add it into landfill, because what happens in landfills is we remove the presence of oxygen, and we also put all of our food into plastic bags, and then it gets dumped on top of each other, and that means there's no longer the presence of any of the soil biology. There's no bugs. There's not the ability for anaerobic bacteria, which is what we want in our worm farms and what we want in our compost. And so what then happens is this food waste that is full of nutrients becomes a total climate disaster when we put it into our rubbish bin and then gets it sent off to landfill. It releases methane, and methane is 25 times more harmful and detrimental to our climate than CO2. So that's the exhaust that comes out of your car, for instance. So there's a great account on here called The Wormmonger, and she talks about food farts. And, you know, that's what's happening. We're putting our food into landfill, and we know this. We know this is a fact. Governments all around the world know that this is a huge disaster that we have been doing for years and years and years. You know, there's no...
We define the word waste.
There's no grey area about this. It's one of the huge factors that's exacerbating climate change around the world. And we can take ownership of that. We can stop losing those nutrients. We can return them to our own soil. And when we do compost aerobically, then we don't release methane. The food waste in our compost bins and worm farms doesn't release methane. So because there's the presence of oxygen and microbes.
Beautifully said. That's a really good summary. And I feel like we've got a pretty good understanding now on the why. If anybody has any questions, please ask. But I want to jump into the how,
Yes.
and for you to explain some of the basic principles of composting. And feel free to, you can move around and show us. But what are some of the principles to composting, and do they apply to all composting?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are 4 universal principles for all composting. And that's so in your worm farm and in your compost bins, even in your tumblers. And that is making sure we always have oxygen, water, carbon, which is the dead, dry, generally brown stuff, and nitrogen, which is our juicy food waste and green garden waste. So if we're adding those 4 elements, then we are going to end up with a really great finished product. But if you forget one of them, so if we load up our worm farms with food and we don't add any dry bedding material, then what's going to happen in your worm farm and in your compost bin, anaerobic, which means oxygen-free conditions, are going to take over, and things are going to start to stink, and things will become slimy and unpleasant. But the great thing about compost is it's not rocket science. So when things go wrong, you can fix them, and carbon so often is the solution to compost problems.
Yeah, I love that. That is something that I think we both reiterate time and time again.
Yes, I talk about carbon all the time.
Carbon is just like your secret superpower to being like a compost champion. And can you share a little bit more about that? Because I think one of the biggest barriers to people not composting is they've tried it once, it was a bit stinky, sludgy, and they're not sure if they're doing it right. Like,
yes.
Why is carbon so important?
So basically, I think that it's important for us to realize that what's happening in our worm farms and what's happening in our compost bins, they are living systems. So they're not a static pile of scraps. There's so much life in there that we need to feed. And so like all life on Earth, they need a balanced diet. So for our compost microbes and our worms, they need a balance of greens and browns. And for making sure that things don't become stinky and anaerobic, you always need to add more browns, that's the carbon, than the green, which is the nitrogen. My ratio that works really well is 60% brown stuff to 40% green stuff. And that serves a couple of purposes. So carbon, which can be in the form of dead, dry leaves, ripped up cardboard, shredded newspaper. So you can use human-made carbon and you can use natural carbon, so things like hay and coconut coir. All of those brown dry sources provide compost microbes with energy to help them multiply and break down our waste. And what they also do is they provide pore space within worm farms and within your compost bin to allow oxygen to sit within all of the organic matter. So it's really important when we think about setting up a worm farm, there's always the emphasis to add in carbon at the very beginning, but you need to be adding in carbon the whole way, the whole time that you're worm farming. And that's when you'll really experience beautiful castings and really happy worms.
Well said. No, thank you. It's a really good explanation. I think people get overwhelmed when they jump online and they see carbon to nitrogen ratios and just get really confused with a lot of the science. And I think it's a good way to define it for everybody, that it is something that you do kind of get the swing of things. Would you agree? Like you kind of just, you see your compost is a little bit too moist, or you get those signs that it's a bit stinky, it's a bit sludgy. Okay, I'll add more carbon. So it kind of becomes like second nature, but it really does solve a lot of the problems.
My saying is brown is best, then chuck in the rest. So every time you feed your food scrap to the worms, feed them browns too. So in my systems, which you can see behind me, I have big compost bins, and then I have little bins of carbon. And you can see, I'll just move this around. I might even take it off.
Let's go for a little tour. Like, because you've got, I'm sure some of the people are asking, like, why do you have so many compost bins?
Because we compost heaps of our community's waste. So we're a family of 5. But we compost beyond our household. So I collect food scraps from local cafes, from my child's school, from neighbours, and that's why we want to have all of these systems up and running to allow us to have that capacity. So this is one of my subpods here.
Sorry, Kate. Before we dive in, we've got a couple of questions.
Oh, yeah, please.
Will chemicals on cardboard from packages break down? I've been using that because brown stuff is hard to come by in the desert.
Yes, that's a great question. So there's compost microbes are pretty miraculous. They are able to render small amounts of chemicals that are present. So it's undeniable that if we're using human-made carbon, like paper and cardboard, there are going to be the presence of some chemicals in there. But it's actually regenerative gardeners, and there's been a lot of research into this, has shown that the composting process renders these safe. But having said that, I'm doing quite a lot of research about human-made carbon for my book, and I'm still unpacking what is safe for edible gardens and what isn't. And there are a few chemicals that don't get lost in the composting process. So one of those is aminopyralid. That's a herbicide. So this is not so much to do with human-made carbon. This is if you're bringing in things like hay and straw or lucerne or sugarcane mulch. You need to be really careful. I'll just flip this back around so you can see my face. You need to be careful of these sources because that is one particular chemical that isn't lost in the composting process. Whereas the chemicals that are in cardboard, a lot of them nowadays are generally safe anyway. So there has been a move towards using glues that are made from carbohydrates, so starches, and inks nowadays are generally soy-based, so they are safe to compost. But it's not a good idea adding in shiny paper, so things like magazine paper, because that does have toxins that you don't want to have ending up in your edible garden.
It's such a loaded question. I get this all the time as well with like, can I compost a compostable X, Y, and Z? And, you know, I love the way you explained that about the toxins, because my chemistry taught me this a while ago, and I've always stuck onto it, is that it's not so much the toxin, but it's the concentration. You know, there's arsenic in the air and we breathe it in. It's toxic, but our body is able to take it out of our system. And it's the same with the soil. You're saying the soil remediation can handle a certain level. It's interesting you're saying some chemicals cannot be processed, but I would imagine the large majority of toxins in there are getting biologically broken down into a simpler compound that is rendered harmless.
Yes, that's exactly right. And that's the really frustrating thing about aminopyralid, is that it actually gets worse in the composting process.
Wow, okay.
But that's actually really relevant for people bringing in commercial compost, because it's often commercial compost that's contaminated with these products because it's applied in pastoral areas, and then animals eat that feedstock. It then comes out in their poo, and a lot of commercial compost is made from wood chips and made from big amounts of animal manure. And if you're getting in commercial compost and not testing it, you are running a real risk that you'll end up with these chemicals in your soil, which are retained in your soil for years. And you can see if you've had aminopyralid contamination, if it's especially it's especially obvious in things like broad beans and tomatoes. You get curled and cupped leaves and it will stunt the growth of plants. So there was a big issue in Australia in 2020 in Melbourne, where one of the big recycling plants that makes a lot of compost, there was widespread contaminated compost that was sold. And it was basically at the start of COVID, when so many people were locked down wanting to garden at home, and then they applied this compost to their garden, and then all of their plants died. And that was then discovered that it was from this commercial compost. That's another reason why we should be composting ourselves.
That is mental. I remember reading that from Katja. That was insane.
Yes.
We have another question here. I have a question. I work in a kindly, and we have our compost bin I was aerating the bin the other day and I found so many worms. Is it dangerous to put citrus in the compost bin with worms present? Oh, great question.
I love this question. So it is a compost myth that we cannot add citrus into our compost. If you imagine what happens out in nature, we have beautiful orange trees and lemon trees, and some of the fruit gets dropped down onto the ground. If these citrus fruits didn't compost, just imagine how much we would have hanging around. It would be everywhere. It does break down, but it is a little bit more of a tricky input. So there's a few things that we need to be aware of. But basically, to put it simply, everything in moderation works in an active compost system. So with our sub pods and our compost bins, we compost citrus all the time. And as long as I'm not overloading my system with mountains and mountains of citrus, it will work. And the reason why you need to be a little bit careful with the quantity of citrus is the microbiome, so the like the digestive tract of your compost bin can get overwhelmed if you add in too much citrus, and it can then become acidic and it can be slow to break down. It is the texture of it is dense and waxy, so to speed up the decomposition of citrus, it is always a good idea to cut it up. What we do at our place as well is we bokashi compost it first. And by pre-digesting it with the EM microbes in my bokashi compost bin, it breaks down really quickly.
I love that. I'm smiling because I have pushed those limits in the early days of Subpod. We've loaded up 20 liters, which is, what is that in gallons? I think it's about less than 7 gallons. And we've put that in a sub pod, and the worms just evacuate for about a week or so. So keep adding the carbon, keep aerating it, and eventually they come back. Have you noticed that with because the sub pod's underground and the worms can come and go, have you seen that relationship?
Yes, absolutely. So we feed small, regular amounts of our bokashi compost to our worms. And in our bokashi compost, we add in meat and dairy and citrus and spicy food and oil, all of those inputs that you may not traditionally want to put into a worm farm. But we bokashi compost them first, and then I feed small amounts into all of our worm farms and into our compost bin. And the worms are not interested in it straight away. But as soon as the compost microbes, because worms and compost microbes work hand in hand. And so once the compost microbes start breaking it down, then the worms actually love the bokashi compost. But the reason why it works so well in a sub pod, and also my little own DIY in-ground worm farms, is the worms can escape when the conditions are not right. And then they'll come back in once the compost microbes have done the job for them.
Yeah, that's a great example. Sounds like you're giving your worms 5-star treatment, bokashi beforehand, and then popping it in the sub pod.
Look, I bokashi compost all of our household food waste. We get lots of raw scraps from cafes, but the reason why I like doing it, I've got 3 kids. It makes my life easier because I just fill up a compost caddy and I chuck everything in. I don't separate scraps out. It's actually easier. And then I allow it to ferment for 2 to 4 weeks. And then I add it into my composting systems.
And do you keep the bokashi in your kitchen as well? So that way you don't have to go outside every time you empty the caddy?
So we've got quite a few bokashi compost bins, Peter.
Yeah.
And the one that we're filling, I do keep in the kitchen, because with the lid on, even though we are composting crazy stuff, last night we had a meal with chicken, so all of the chicken bones ended up in there. It doesn't smell because it's actually a different, so I should note this, it's anaerobic fermentation. So we think about
people are going to be confused.
Yes, I'm going to describe it. So we know that landfill is an anaerobic condition, but it doesn't have any microbes. So in a bokashi compost bin, it is oxygen free, which is anaerobic, but we are actually adding in beneficial anaerobic bacteria that ferments your waste. And so we're not creating little mini landfills in our kitchens and gardens with bokashi bins, because we're adding in the right bacteria that ferments and breaks down the waste. It's not putrefying or rotting, it's fermenting.
It is marvelous, isn't it? I read somewhere that EM was discovered in Japan in baby feces. I'm not really sure what they were doing looking in there. But
I'm a mother of 3. I've looked at lots of baby feces.
Next time you run out of EM
I,
grain.
no, that's interesting. I have to read more about that. I have it did originate in Japan, but I didn't know the origin story of coming from that.
It could have just been something that ended up on the internet.
Yeah,
But I thought it was had some good merit behind it. I want to ask a bit about somebody that's umming and ahhing about composting.
yes.
I know you got brought up with composting, but a lot of people out there are like, you know what, I don't have the time, I don't have the knowledge, and I just don't, I don't, to be honest, like a lot of people out there don't want to fail, which I get. But
Yes,
what would you
yes.
say to them out there? You spend a lot of your time educating and helping and inspiring, but what would you say to those people right now?
Look, I would say you actually don't have to compost yourself if you don't want to. So one thing that a really great app that I'm a big advocate for is Share Waste. And that is a free global app, and it connects you with compost hosts in your local area. And if you don't want to compost yourself, you can become a compost donor, and you can give your food waste to people that have compost bins, and they can do the dirty work for you. So that's a really great thing to do. But equally, you can find really simple compost methods that can work. So if you want to have a hands-off approach that is really easy and you have the space, so this does mean you need to have a little bit of a garden with a little bit of access to soil. You can have a go of something that's called trench composting, which is just a fancy word for digging a hole in the soil and chucking your food waste in. So you don't need to worry about carbon with that. You just put your food waste in, and all of the biology in the soil will break it down for you. Cold composting as well, or slow composting, is a really easy process, and that you don't need to be actively aerating it if you build it with enough robust, chunky carbon. So there's definitely simple methods that you can do that are honestly not much harder than chucking your food waste in the bin.
I love that. Now that's true. There's so many easy ways to just start. I've got a question here. What do you add on top of your bokashi once you add it to your compost? Ooh.
So basically, sorry, excuse me, your bokashi compost, your full bin of fermented waste is like a nitrogen bomb for your compost. So you always thinking about the C/N ratio, so balancing greens to browns. When I add in a full bokashi compost bin into my composting systems, I balance it with at least 50 to 60% carbon. And what I like to do with my bokashi is I empty it out into a wheelbarrow and I pre-mix it with carbon, because breaking it up, when you first empty it out, it's like a big lump of fermented food waste. And if you can break it up, you're starting to get oxygen into it, because when you are putting it into a compost bin, it's changing from an anaerobic state to a really aerobic state. So you can speed up that process by breaking it up and pre-mixing carbon into it. Add that into your compost system, so small amounts into your worm farms, bigger amounts into your compost bin, and then make sure you cover it with carbon too.
That's a great way to explain that. I want to ask about your experience, because you've got so many compost systems out there, and you've got everything from you've got what I like to call the upside down coffee cups.
Yes.
Then you've got your do-it-yourself worm farms. Then you've got a bokashi. You've got a sub pod. What's your experience with all these different types of compost systems? Why would one person get one over another? Or maybe start with worms, because worms are. Answer that question.
Yes, but I will talk about worms as well, because I think the first thing when you're deciding about what compost system works for you, you need to do a little bit of, it doesn't need to be a formal process, but an informal audit of your waste. So you look at the waste that you're creating as a household, whether you live by yourself or whether you have a family, and don't just look at your green waste and your food waste. Look at your carbon waste as well. So whether you have kids that are constantly doing really bad art, that you don't want to keep all of that, think about all of these different scraps that you have. Work out, it's a good idea thinking about how much in a week you produce, and then you can start thinking about the size of the system that you want to go with. So we produce a lot of compost here because we compost a lot of waste from outside of our household. So we need to have lots of different systems. And, I have different systems because I educate about this as well. But for people at home, I think it's a great idea looking at what you produce. So if you don't have mountains of food waste, then maybe a small standalone DIY worm farm is a great idea. You know, something little that you can fit into a pot or put into a garden bed. If you have a lot of garden waste, so every season, if you're pruning plants, mowing lawns, then you're wanting to look at a bigger system. And I really love 400 litre bins and bigger, because the bigger the volume that you can create, you can then explore hot composting, which is a really exciting way to quickly break down your waste as well.
Oh yeah, there's so much there I'd love to talk about with hot composting. But I think that's a great explanation to have, because if you've got more food waste, then worms are probably going to be better suited to you.
Yes.
Whereas and I love the do-it-yourself buckets. Like that was the premise behind SubPod. We noticed at the very start, using these for years, if we just increase the size and we increase the population and diversity of microbes, you can do a whole bunch of other things. There's less chances of rodents coming in there. It's just becomes a lot more solid. But you know, the principles are very much similar in the sense that you're underground and therefore the worms are insulated. Can you talk a bit more about that? Composting underground and how that's different to composting above ground?
Yes, absolutely. So it's hugely beneficial connecting your compost systems and your worm farms into the soil food web, because that allows the transference of all of the biology that's in the soil to move in and out of your compost system. It also has a big benefit in terms of the insulating factor that you've just mentioned, Peter. So in Australia, we have incredibly hot summers, and the earth that surrounds my SubPod and my little DIY bins helps keep the worms cool. But interestingly, in winter as well, the surrounding soil also helps keep the worms warm. So worms are pretty resilient to some temperatures, but they don't like extreme cold, and they absolutely don't like extreme hot. So connecting them into the soil is really, really great, because you know that's where they have evolved. They haven't evolved to live in worm farms. They've evolved to live under the surface layer of leaf litter on our forest floors. So replicating that in our home composting systems by composting underground just makes life easier, and you'll end up with finished worm castings a lot faster.
That's great. I was smiling there because I don't know if you saw some of our videos of people using the SubPod in -20 Fahrenheit, which is like -30 Celsius, and it just blew my mind that all they'd done was increase the insulation, or like put a bunch of leaves in the SubPod, and they were actually they were like, I wouldn't say they were active, but they were alive.
They're alive.
Blows my mind. I'm like, how is this possible? Of course, it doesn't get this cold in Australia, so we have no idea.
No, we're wimps when it comes to winter. Yeah, it is really amazing. And you know, you can also, so carbon provides a lot of insulation. So in the top of all of my worm farms, I always cover my food waste and worm castings with carbon, because it serves a couple of processes. We know it feeds the microbes and it feeds the worms, but also it helps keep the ambient temperature of the worm farm at a level that's is pleasing for them to keep on breeding and eating our waste. And that's an important thing to do all year round. It also creates a barrier for stopping fruit flies and gnats and vinegar flies and blowflies. So if you're making sure you're always covering your food waste, when you aerate your bin, put a little bit more in, and it will just, it helps in so many ways.
I love that. I know we're going over time, Kate, but I'm just really enjoying this. We got one last question, and we'll let you go. How do you know when your compost is ready to be used in the garden? I had to end with that question. It's too good.
Yes, that's a great question, and it's an important thing that I've been educating people about, because it can be really tempting. So I'm going to talk about it first with compost, and then I'll talk about it with worm castings. So it can be tempting once you open up your compost bin lid and you look down and you see that all of your organic matter no longer looks like food waste and leaves and cardboard. It looks like soil. It can be tempting to apply it to your garden at that point. But there's actually a final step that's really important and makes the compost much more stable and much more beneficial to your plants. And that's called the curing process. So that basically allows all of the organic matter that looks like soil to become much more stable. And at that point, especially if you're hot composting, you need to wait until the temperature of your organic matter has returned to the ambient outdoor temperature. So if it's 20 degrees outside, your compost should also be 20 degrees. You need to leave it at that point for about 2 months, and you'll see a lot more activity of worms and lots of microbes and lots of other organisms finishing off the composting process. And that means that your finished compost, when you apply it to your garden bed, will be perfectly suitable for plants. Worm castings, you don't need to cure it. So the process that happens in the worm's gut, there's really magical things that happen in the gut of a worm. And
it's so cool. Yeah.
They end up producing their castings, so the fancy word for poo, in a form that is incredibly stable and nutrient packed for plants. You can apply worm castings to your plants as soon as they look like castings. You don't need to leave them for any period because all of the nutrients are bioavailable straight away.
Thank you so much. We've got a few other questions, but I'll have to say, everybody, please leave them in the comments. We'll be posting this live afterwards. I'm going to let Kate finish with some words, or just anyone you want to say to the people watching right now.
Oh, look, I just think it's worthwhile getting excited about composting because it's a really simple, sustainable action that you can do in your own home, and it empowers you to create a closed system for the waste, so you can return all of these nutrients to your soil. It is addictive, so be warned. Once you get one compost bin or one worm farm, you may want more, but it's definitely not a bad addiction to have.
Really cool way to end it. Well, thank you so much, Kate. Really appreciate your time. Thanks everybody for tuning in
always
here.
Nice chatting to you.
And definitely jump onto Kate's Instagram. There is tons and tons of information there. It's always fun. It's always inspirational, and I get a lot out of it. So thank you so much, Kate.
Thank you,
really
Peter.
appreciate your time today.